10 years ago, if you asked people which African countries were never colonized, they would likely say Ethiopia and Liberia. In fact, many popular African YouTubers promoted Liberia as a country that was always free. However, this could not be further from the truth. What is true is that Liberia was extremely close to being one of the African countries never colonized. To understand Liberia's history, we first need to differentiate between settler colonies and extractive colonies. Countries like Australia, South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, and the United States are all examples of settler colonies, whereas countries like India, Ghana, and Senegal were extractive colonies. Settler colonies focused not on exploiting resources, but on occupying the land itself. They were founded by settlers to create new homes, and the settlers often imposed their own culture, systems, and governance, ruling in a way that benefited themselves while marginalizing indigenous communities. Many people say Liberia was founded by Black Americans, and this is partly true. The region was not called Liberia, nor viewed as a nation before it became a settler colony. However, it was already inhabited by indigenous African communities whose presence is often erased by the term founded. Unlike other West African countries, which welcomed free Black Americans into local towns, Liberia became a settler colony, where freed slaves established their own governance and systems, often displacing indigenous peoples. Before Liberia became a settlement for freed slaves, many escaped to Canada, Caribbean islands, Latin America, Sierra Leone, and sometimes Nigeria. In 1787, freed slaves settled in Sierra Leone over a 20-year period and established Freetown under British oversight. They integrated with the local communities, forming the Creole people, a distinct ethnic group that blended economically and culturally but did not dominate the land. In Nigeria, freed slaves were settled in places like Badagry and Lagos, though in far smaller numbers, often merging into indigenous communities without forming separate towns. About 30,000 freed slaves settled in Sierra Leone, whereas only a few thousand settled in Nigeria. Contrary to popular belief, Sierra Leone received more freed slaves than Liberia ever did. Liberia became interesting to American abolitionists several years after Sierra Leone had welcomed freed slaves. At this time, Liberia remained uncolonized, inhabited entirely by indigenous kingdoms and peoples, and had been largely ignored by European powers for over 400 years. By the late 1700s, the United States had a growing population of free African Americans, and many white Americans, including progressives, believed that freed slaves would struggle to integrate into U.S. society. They proposed relocating freed slaves outside of the United States. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1816 to organize the resettlement of freed slaves. Its leaders, including Finley, Clay, and Washington, viewed the colonization of Africans as a practical solution. West Africa was chosen as the only suitable region because, while many European colonies existed there, most were extractive rather than settlement colonies. Liberia, in particular, had not been colonized and remained largely under indigenous control. It had gone under the radar of European powers, making it seem like a free region suitable for settlement. Between 1821 and 1822, the American Colonization Society sent white American scouts to survey the region. In 1822, the first group of freed slaves arrived to settle. Initial settlements began without formal agreements with indigenous peoples, as was typical of colonization. As tensions grew due to the loss of indigenous land, negotiations began in 1823. Representatives of the society negotiated with local chiefs to purchase land, paying in goods, money, and other trade items. Over the next 20 years, settlement expanded as more freed slaves arrived, requiring further negotiations with chiefs from different ethnic groups. Each indigenous group had distinct cultures, languages, and customs, and a chief from one group would obviously not know that land had already been sold by a chief from another ethnic group. By 1847, all of what is now Liberia was under the control of the American Colonization Society and the settlers, as all lands within that region had been purchased from different chiefs. That same year, freed slaves, later known as Americo-Liberians, declared independence. The society willingly handed over control, having achieved its goal of creating a settlement for freed slaves, and it lacked the resources to maintain long-term governance overseas. For indigenous Liberians, independence meant very little, since the oppression they faced before independence remained the same afterward. Before independence, the country's main ethnic groups, including the Kru, Bassa, Geo, Grebo, and Mandingo, had long-established communities, trade networks, and governance structures. As settlers purchased land, indigenous groups were gradually pushed out of their lands and denied control over key ports and fertile farming areas. Although Americo-Liberians were initially a minority, their systematic power structures and support from the American Colonization Society allowed them to dominate politically, economically, and culturally. American-style institutions, religion, and governance were imposed, and indigenous people were excluded from political decision-making. Settlers enforced authority with militias, leaving indigenous communities little choice but to comply. After independence, nothing substantially changed for indigenous people. While the American Colonization Society no longer governed Liberia, settlers remained politically in control. Indigenous Liberians were systematically excluded from politics, lawmaking, and national elections to ensure that only those of American heritage could lead the country. They were pushed from fertile coastal lands, had restricted access to trade, and saw their practices, languages, and governance suppressed. Schools and churches primarily served settler children, leaving indigenous communities with limited education. Even when indigenous groups resisted, they lacked the military and political power to succeed, and the American Colonization Society continued to provide financial, military, and political support. This systematic suppression created a social hierarchy, where some indigenous people claimed Americo-Liberian heritage to gain status. Today, indigenous culture and influence are often underrepresented in Liberia. On paper, formal systematic oppression ended in 1980 with a coup, which overthrew the Americo-Liberian elite after over 130 years of dominance. In conclusion, whilst Liberia was never colonized by Europeans, like its neighboring countries, it was colonized by Americans, making it the only American colony on the continent. Furthermore, the term founded in the context of Liberia does not imply that the region was devoid of indigenous peoples or kingdoms. Rather, it means that it was not a unified nation before the American settlement. The region was already home to diverse groups of indigenous peoples, each with their own cultures, traditions, and governance, who maintained full control over their lands and lifestyles prior to 1821. It is difficult to determine whether Liberia would have remained independent had it not been colonized by Americans. However, one thing is certain. While its neighbors were under foreign control for 400 years, the peoples of Liberia largely retained authority over their own affairs, a fact that history has often overlooked or attempted to erase.